I want to thank all of you for being here. For the record, my name is Reverend Stephen Milton, and tonight we're going to talk about this is the second of a few talks on the birth of early Christian art. And the very earliest art, which we looked at last time, was the art which appeared in the catacombs, which are those burial places underground. And that's where Christians first started painting things on walls. And tonight we're going to shift towards another type of art that they made a little bit later called sarcophagi. So a
Mhm.
sarcophagus is basically a stone coffin. This is a stone coffin. So this is a sarcophagus. Sarcophagus is big enough to fit a body or two into, because sometimes two people would go in there. And in Rome, they were generally made out of marble. And to keep things interesting, they didn't just have a stone coffin; they would also decorate it. And what I want to do tonight is spend the first while showing you what the Romans were doing with their sarcophagi before Christians started to make their own. So you can sort of get a baseline of what was going on before the Christians started making their own form of art out of these. Oops. So this is a typical Roman sarcophagus. This one comes from the 3rd century in Naples, and it's a sarcophagus for a married couple. And you can see their two faces there, and there's a couple of putti, or kind of like cupids, who are holding um, fruit and plants, which it's sort of like the equivalent of a horn of plenty. So it gives you a sense that these people were dying and going. They're probably wealthy, and also they were imagining that they were going to a place which was very opulent. So in my last talk, I mentioned that the Romans didn't get buried much. They tended to get burned, right? They would cremate their bodies. And that was certainly true in the 1st century. But in the 2nd century or so, after Jesus, in the 2nd century or so, that fashion starts to shift, and they start wanting to bury themselves. And these sarcophagi, which are big, right? Just imagine how big your body is, and then surround it with marble. They're expensive. They're expensive to just have the marble coffin made, and then that much more expensive to have them carved. So when we see a sarcophagus, we know that someone had money, and you can almost tell how much money they have by how well decorated a sarcophagus is. Now, in the beginning, Christians who like to bury their dead without cremating them, Christians didn't have a whole lot of money. We can tell from both the book of Acts as well as early Christian writings and the writings of their critics that a lot of the early Christians were poor people. Um, their Roman critics would say, you're just a religion full of slaves and women. Like, who cares what you guys think? And it kind of makes sense that the Christian message would have been well received by women and people who are enslaved, since they were precisely the parts of Roman society who had the least power. And yet the Christian message was that they were just as important as anybody else. So it's only in the late 3rd century, so late 200s, that Christians start to have enough money to start making sarcophagi. So that's when the record starts, in the late 200s. And this means that they can, they have to make a choice, right? Are they going to have a sarcophagus that looks exactly like the Roman ones, or do they want to make ones which are specifically Christian? So, to give you a sense of how Christianity changes the sensibility of its believers, I want to show you a whole bunch of Roman pagan sarcophagi first. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at another one. So here's one that I saw in Naples. So this was made for someone who had died, and what it depicts is a series of gladiatorial scenes. It depicts the kind of games that would happen in the Colosseum in Rome, and those sorts of amphitheaters were found throughout the Roman Empire. And so I'm going to show you a close-up shot in a second of the middle panel here. Okay, so this is what's happening in the middle panel. On the left, a man is being dressed to fight in a gladiatorial game. Same thing's happening in the very middle. And then on the right, we see the gladiators in their armor fighting each other. Now, gladiatorial games weren't just about men fighting each other, it was also men against animals. And I'll show you some examples in a second, but this particular frieze has multiple animals being released, and in this case, someone is putting a spear through the head of what seems to be a bull. Up at the very top, we see this lineup of people who are probably enslaved people, bringing the helmets of gladiators to a man in a toga. You see him on the far right. He's standing with one hand pointing towards the left. That man is likely the deceased, the person for whom this frieze was commissioned. And it's unclear, the ancient Romans weren't Mayans, so these probably aren't the heads of the gladiators. Gladiators are expensive to train, so generally speaking, they didn't want them to die in the games. But certainly gladiators would get defeated, so it's entirely possible that this procession of enslaved people are bringing the helmets of the gladiators who happen to be defeated either in a single game or symbolizing the many defeated gladiators that this particular man who died had seen. So this guy is really into gladiatorial scenes. So there's the whole thing again. And this man chose for his funeral stone to show violence, to show people fighting each other, animals getting slaughtered, and slaves lining up with the symbolic heads of defeated gladiators. This may seem like a weird thing to put on your tombstone, but what we need to remember is that Roman society was actually incredibly violent by our standards. Back in ancient Roman times, like in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the heads of households were all powerful. Men had all the power. If you want to get a sense of what Roman society was like, just think Sicilian mafia, okay? So very, very traditional gender roles where the men are in charge of everything. The sons are basically lackeys of their fathers until their fathers die. The sons would be entrusted with things, but there was no question who was the authority figure within a household. Women didn't have a whole lot of power, and daughters weren't really useful until they got married and started having children. Generally speaking, a wealthy household would have a lot of enslaved people in it. And those enslaved people were considered property. Same way a dog or an oxen or a cow was considered property. And in Roman society, it was legal to kill your own slave. You could beat them and you could kill them. It's up to you. It's your property. Do what you want with it. You could conceivably kill a neighbor's enslaved person, but if you did that, you'd have to pay them some money because you'd ruin some of their property. Okay, so murder, as we understand it, didn't really apply in Rome because it was okay to kill people within your household as long as they weren't free. Okay, like as in freeborn or freed from slavery. Equally, when there wasn't a penitentiary system in ancient Rome, there wasn't a prison system, there wasn't really even a police system. So if one, let's say a man from one household got into a dispute with a man from another household and killed him on the street, that was a problem. People would get upset about it, but there was no such thing as a life sentence, and there wasn't even capital punishment. Instead, just the man who had done the murder would be exiled, which would be very costly and not something that you would want. But murder wasn't considered a deep, deep abiding sin the way it is now. And as a result, Roman society was just kind of violent. People were getting hurt and killed all the time. And one of the places where they got hurt and killed on a regular basis was the Colosseums or the amphitheaters. So this is the Roman Colosseum. I was there this summer. It used to go all the way around. It is a ruin, so some parts of it are missing. This is what it looks like from the inside. That white area represents the kind of stage that was in the middle, and the circular area around it was where everybody would sit. And people would spend the morning and afternoon here on their day off, just watching the games. The area beyond the white stage is what it looked like under the white stage. So it's being left exposed. And there was a series of tunnels and hallways underneath the stage so that gladiators and animals could be popped open through trap doors onto the stage. And for instance, in the morning at a game, a day at the games, they would create a fake forest or a fake jungle and then introduce animals into it, who would be hunted. Um, so that looked like this. And so they would have giraffes and elephants and other exotic animals, lions, as you can see in the bottom panel here, deer. And there were specific hunters who had particular tools, and they would hunt down these animals in front of everybody and kill them. But also, if you look at the top, on the top panel to the left, you see a leopard leaping at a man who's tied up. And at the bottom, you can see someone who's naked as well. Prisoners of war, as well as criminals, would be thrown into these scenes so they could be hunted down by the animals as well. So people would gather, eating the equivalent of popcorn and having a beer and watch people murdered in the morning by animals. And in the afternoon, the gladiators would come out and they would fight each other, but they would also hunt down criminals and prisoners of war and later Christians and kill them in front of everybody too. It was expensive to train gladiators, but it was quite entertaining to watch prisoners of war and other people who were considered enemies of the state be slaughtered. So murder was everywhere. It would be like going to a football game and expecting to see 20 people die. And that was just common people, right? Just regular everyday people got a day off. Hey, you want to go to the Coliseum? Sure, that'd be kind of fun. And in the morning, you'd watch animals and prisoners die. In the afternoon, you'd watch prisoners die and gladiators fight each other. And there was always the question of, maybe one gladiator would get the other gladiator on his knees and then he'd gesture to the emperor, do you want me to kill him or not? And usually they didn't kill the gladiators because they were so expensive to train. But there was an insensitivity to human life in Roman society that was just pervasive, absolutely pervasive. It was normal to watch people die for entertainment, and it was normal to even be able to kill people in your household if you were really annoyed with how your slave was acting up. So that sensibility is shown on the sorts of sarcophagi which people chose to have made when they died. So here's one. This one is, this is a battle sarcophagus. So take a good look here. Lots of horses trampling people. In the middle, you can see a horse's hoofs about to crush a man's skull. The dressed people are, this may well be a mythic scene, but you get the idea. There's naked, the enemy is naked, I think, in this case. And the victors are the ones who have the armor on. You can see prisoners who are tied up, right, with their hands behind them. Up on the top register, there's a number of women who have been taken prisoner, and they look very depressed, and their men are tied up. So, but this is something someone decided to have on their tomb. Imagine that, right? You're considering what you want to have on your tombstone in Mount Pleasant. You go, I'm not sure if I want a hanging or an execution on my tombstone. Here's another one. Sometimes what they would do is they would show scenes from ancient myths. So this is called the Rape of Persephone. In the middle, you see a semi-naked woman who is being carried off by a man who is Hades, the ruler of the underworld. She's being put into a chariot, and that chariot's going to go down into the earth. A couple of gods are watching. They're the ones on the far right. And on to the woman's left is Athena, who's trying to hold her back. She doesn't actually want to see Persephone kidnapped. And so again, like this is a scene of someone being taken against their will, kidnapped, taken down to hell, where they'll spend 6 months of the year. And this is why crops don't grow for 6 months of the year, because Persephone is well, actually, Demeter is the goddess of agriculture, as I recall, and Persephone is her daughter, and Demeter is very upset that Persephone goes missing, so crops won't grow for half of the year, while Persephone is with Hades, and they work out a deal that she'll only be there for half of the time. But the point is that she's being abducted against her will, and the word rape at this time doesn't mean sexual assault. Specifically, it means abduction, although sexual assault probably happened as well. Now, the thing to recognize as well is that when the pagans depicted the gods, they tended to depict them naked. So Hades, the man with the beard here, is naked. Persephone is mostly naked. She's got a small sort of shift around her waist. But generally speaking, gods are depicted as naked. Here's one of this is a child sarcophagus. And here it's a sort of playful interpretation of a chariot race. And if you look in the middle there, you can see that one of the chariots has, one of the horses has fallen. There's been kind of a crash, and one of the putti, the sort of cupids, is doing a face plant. Oh, look at this mess. People are being trampled, but it's all in good fun, because it's a chariot race. Here's another one. This one was done for a husband and wife. So you can see the wife on the left at the top, husband on the right. And below them, there's a mythic scene of, this is the scene where Achilles attacks the Amazonians, right? The Amazonians are those famous women warriors. So if you look closely, you can see a whole bunch of women warriors here. And you can see a bunch of naked men. So the men are attacking the women. The god Achilles is holding the queen of the Amazons, who he has just killed. But when he looks into her eyes, he recognizes how beautiful she is. And story has it that he falls in love with her as she dies in his arms. The faces of the husband and wife have been used for Achilles and the Amazonian queen to show their tender love for each other. But Achilles has just killed the queen. And yet this couple thought it was appropriate to use this scene to show their love for each other in the midst of a battle scene where women are being slaughtered, and the woman representing the deceased wife is dying in the arms of Achilles, who's just killed her. I'm going to stop there for a second. So it's a really, really different sensibility. Like, violence is okay. And if you want to put together a tombstone, it's perfectly okay to have a violent tombstone. Any questions or comments before I go on?
Yes, Stephen, I have a question.
Hmm.
It's Vicky. So you seem to indicate there's a distance between the frieze or what is going on in the scene and how the people died. Is there any indication that some of the scenes actually indicate how the person died?
No, I mean, generally speaking, these sorts of sarcophagi are projecting wealth, but they're also projecting education, because they're showing off that they know these Greek myths, because they're generally Greek myths. So it'd be like one of us, quoting from T.S. Eliot on our tombstone,
Okay.
showing off our education. But there's no suggestion in these things that, this couple chose this scene because the husband killed the wife or anything like that. They're just, to them, it's not in bad taste to show a violent scene on your tombstone or on your coffin.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? You can say just yuck if you want.
Stephen, I just wanted to, from what you said so far in the images you've shown, it seems to me it's almost more than just an insensitivity. It's a bloodlust. It's this, I'm entertained by watching people die, and I'm entertained by, like, it seems to me to be more than just it's happening and I don't care. I'm actually actively pursuing opportunities to make this part of my life. It just seems to me that there's a bloodlust here, and I don't know if it relates to the culture of the day, or if it's just if they were so insensitized that it was just part of their everyday lives.
Bonnie?
Another factor is that the Romans were always at war. And so
True.
death and bloodshed and heroism, or the desire for it, were just common, and much more common than for us. And they were desensitized that way, by that factor even further.
Yeah, that's right. And the people who were being slaughtered live in front of the crowds would often be prisoners of war who were brought back. Prisoners of war were also often conscripted to become gladiators, because
Right.
the Romans, all things considered, were quite short. I went to Pompeii for a day, and it was clear that the people who lived here were maybe 5'2", 5'3".
Yeah.
Whereas the gladiators tended to be big people from, the Germanic tribes and so forth. So, but the other thing to consider is, none of these sarcophagi were just off the shelf, right? You had to make them to order. And although there were recurring motifs and stuff, which the carvers knew how to do well, for like a battle sarcophagus, like that's just a lot of work. And a man who decides to have a battle sarcophagus, right? Just showing whether it's a real battle or a mythical one, he's projecting a sense of, I am a man of power, right? Like I don't know if
Yeah.
he's, we could debate whether that means bloodlust, right? Ask the people he was hurting. They may say, yeah, of course he was full of bloodlust. But at minimum, he was saying, I'm a macho guy. When I die, I want people to see that I like chariot races, or I like the forum, or I liked, battles. Maybe I'm an old soldier and I'd like to have a battle scene on my sarcophagus.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Vicky?
Yes, so it sounds to me like these people commissioned the sarcophagus, but
Yeah.
while they were still living.
It depends. Sometimes the inscriptions will say that this was my wife died first, and then I created this sarcophagus in her honor. That kind of thing happens. But yeah, sometimes it would be commissioned by both people before they died, and sometimes it was after one of them died if it was a couple sarcophagus.
That makes sense.
Lest I give you totally like I saw a lot of sarcophagi, and a lot of them were very violent, but not all of them. Like, for instance, here's one which this one isn't violent, even though it shares some of the imagery of the violent ones. On the left, you see a sleeping shepherd, right? And the artist has tried to give a sense of distance, like, a hill with sheep on it, by piling them up on top of each other. So not a great example of 3D representation. And then there's a goddess with wings holding a horse, and the horse is pulling a chariot. And just a little bit to the right of center, we see a woman who has one breast exposed, looking down on a man who's mostly naked. The woman is actually a goddess. She's the goddess of the moon, Selene. And she has come to visit the beautiful youth Endymion, who, according to Greek myth, was, instead of dying, he asked, just let me sleep forever. So he was cursed to sleep forever, but he was beautiful. And the moon goddess Selene falls in love with him. And the story goes that she would visit him every night and gaze upon his beauty. And some of the versions of the story say that she would make love to him, and she had multiple children by him, even though he never woke up. So this was this is a scene which implies eternal rest, because that's what's happening with Endymion. He's sleeping forever, and he is admired by others, specifically Selene. So this one's supposed to have a kind of pastoral feel to it, except that you know, he's asleep. He's being exploited by her because she's gazing on him, even if it's in admiration. In some of the stories, she's having sex with him against his will. Again, even the kind of bucolic ones have a dark underside to them. But this one is meant to just suggest eternal rest, because that's what we hope for our loved ones when they die. So overall, the Romans were really into violence, didn't have a problem with coercion. They usually put a myth on the front of their tombs. Most of the time, they're depicting some sort of myth, and it's usually a Greek myth, because Greek is considered the high cultural standard to which the Romans are always trying to aspire. And all of their sculpture, or most of their sculptures, are based on ancient Greek models. And as we've seen, one of the things about the gods is that they're usually depicted naked. So here's an example of, this is a bunch of gods who are hunting a boar. So the gods are all naked. You can see their penises and stuff hanging out. This is just normal. You know, if you wanted to depict a god, you're going to have to make them naked. And again, you know, this is a scene of violence, this time in terms of what's happening to the boar. All over the city, there would be all over the city, there were naked gods and goddesses statues just everywhere. The Roman Colosseum had them circling the whole place. They could be found in shrines and outside temples. This is one of Aphrodite, also known as Venus. And often when emperors wanted to compare themselves to gods or claim that they were gods, which is what started happening in the first century, they would get promoted to godlike status. They too would show up dressed half naked. So this is Emperor Tiberius. He's in power when Jesus is alive. He's portrayed half naked so that the people looking at it, so Roman citizens will realize, oh, he's not just a man, he's also got the god's favor, and he is indeed himself at least a demigod. And the way you got that across was by showing them naked. Okay, long preamble, but the reason I wanted to show you all this was that when the Christians decided to start having sarcophagi made, they had some decisions to make. They had to decide, when they depict Jesus, should he be naked? Seems like a silly question to us, but to them, that would have been a real concern, because gods are naked. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God in human form. By Roman pagan standards, he should be naked. So that was the first question. The other thing was, for the sarcophagi, since they are talking about this new religion, which they hope will triumph over other religions, and they feel it's at least as, you know, Christians didn't say, you know what, our God is just one God of many. You have your gods, we'll have our gods. They didn't talk like that. They said all of your gods are fictional. They're figments of your imagination, or at worst, they are the delusions brought upon by demons who are fooling you into sacrificing to them. Our God is the only real God. So therefore, one could imagine the Christians choosing to depict scenes of battle from the Bible, right? There's lots of scenes, say Pharaoh's army being drowned in the Red Sea. Why not depict that on all of the sarcophagi? That's what the pagans would do. They would just choose battle scenes and show, see, our God's better than your gods. We're powerful. We deserve to be in charge. Here's a battle scene from the Bible. And goodness knows there's lots of those, right? So were they going to show battle scenes? And then the other question was, how should Jesus be depicted? So now let's take a look at some Christian sarcophagi, and I'll show you the decisions they made. Before I do that, though, any questions or comments before I proceed? I know it's a lot to take in. It's kind of weird. And in some ways, it's going to get even weirder. So let's take a look at a Christian sarcophagus. And what we'll do is we will spend a fair bit of time on this one, just so you can start to understand how it works. Okay, so behavior. There we go. So this is a Christian sarcophagus from around between the year 330 and 360. And it was found in one of the churches outside the city walls, St. Paul outside the walls. So I'm going to just walk through this really, really slowly because there's a lot happening here. Let's start with the center and go to the right, and then we'll double back to the left. So on the far left here in this picture, so this is the second half of the picture, the woman on the far left is the woman who has died. So this is her sarcophagus. She's holding a book in her hand, which shows that she's a woman of learning. And next to her, we see a man pointing to a small man carrying a bed. This is Jesus. So Jesus is speaking to her. You can see that his head is facing her. And he's using his fingers to cure the man who came in on the bed, and Jesus healed him, right? And told him, take up your bed and go home. This is in Matthew chapter 9. Moving to the right again, we see a man with his fingers on a small man's eyes. This is Jesus again, obviously healing a man who was blind. So note that the people who are being healed are depicted as being half size, right? So they're trying to symbolically give a sense of who the disciples are versus who are just the regular people who are around the disciples. Moving again to the right, we see Jesus again. And this time he has a stick in his hand, and he's pointing it at a series of jars. So anybody want to guess which miracle this refers to?
Water into wine?
Water.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the wedding at Cana. So it's the water into wine. And one of the funny things about how these sarcophagi represent miracles is that when Jesus is doing a miracle with an inanimate object, something which is not alive, he is given this kind of magic wand. If he is doing a miracle with someone who is alive, he just uses his fingers and he doesn't need a magic wand. And then, so with the water into wine, of course, it's an inanimate object, so he uses this wand. There's no tradition of magic wands for miracles or godlike powers in the Roman tradition. So this is an innovation by the Christians, and it's not meant to suggest that Jesus actually carried a magic wand. It's just a visual way of getting across that he's doing a miracle. Because if his hand was just drooping down towards some jars, it wouldn't be clear that he was doing a miracle on the jars. And then an interesting example of it is, again, let's move to the right. And there's Jesus with his magic wand tapping a dead body. So that would be Lazarus, who gets the magic wand treatment because he isn't alive. He's going to be alive, but at the moment of the miracle, he is an inanimate object. And the woman at his feet is probably Mary or Martha, but might also be the woman who anointed Jesus. So as you can see, whereas the Roman sarcophagi would just show you one scene, the Christians decided to just pile on the scenes, one after another, after another, after another. Jesus shows up 1, 2, 3, 4 times in a row in just a few feet. So let me just stop there for a second. Any comments or impressions or questions about that? Anne, you're muted. I can't hear you.
It's a much more peaceful scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Totally.
Yeah, no battles, no killing. Yeah, that's right.
It's rather boring, but on the other hand, you'd have to be learned. You really have to know and understand the miracles that Jesus wrought in order to really understand and read that, right?
Presumably you'd have to be familiar with them at least.
Right.
And it's interesting that they're not content with just one, right? I mean, you think that they could have just said, give me a sarcophagus with just one great miracle on the front of it, but that's not where they went. They wanted to have a whole bunch, one after another, after another, after another. Jim?
I'm not sure I know how to ask the question, but Christology took time to form and solidify, right?
Yeah, yep.
Was from at this point in time, would he already have been recognized as unmistakably divine?
Yes, although he would have been considered, well, he would have definitely been considered the Son of God. So that makes him divine. Just trying to think. So this is around 330. So it's before Augustine, who writes in the late 400s, or in the 400s rather. When we looked at the catacombs last time, there were representations of the Holy Spirit. So there was a Trinitarian sort of sense, and those were being done in the 200s. So this is the 300s. So yeah, they do have a sense of the Trinity. And I guess the Nicene Creed is developed in what, 325. So yeah, they certainly have a sense of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So yeah, Jesus definitely would have been considered divine. And actually we can see further proof of that. I think it's in the same sarcophagus. Yeah, the same sarcophagus gives even further proof of that, which I'll show you in a second. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so let me show you the other side of the same sarcophagus. Because so far we've been seeing New Testament scenes, right? Very familiar from the Gospels. But now this is the other side of it. So does anybody recognize anybody in this?
Oh. It
Is it
looks
like the Garden of Eden?
yeah,
Yeah.
Eve is on the
Yeah,
right
well,
and Adam.
Yeah, exactly. So they're clutching the fig leaves to their genitalia.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a snake on the tree. Eve's got the apple in her hand,
Yeah.
right? So you got
Mhm.
Adam and Eve. That's pretty clear. And it makes sense why they'd be naked, right? Because that's how the story goes. They were naked.
Yeah.
But the man next to them, like to their left, has the same face and hair as Jesus, which is interesting, right? So, and he's holding in his left hand, the one that's drooping down, a sheaf of wheat. So this is the point at which in the story, God says that you're going to have to live by the sweat of your brow. No more just plucking fruit off of trees and living the easy life. You're going to have to work for it, and you're going to have to raise wheat from the ground. But the artist has chosen to depict God as Jesus. And what's really interesting is if you go further to the left, you see two men, right, leaning forward towards a bearded man. One man is holding a lamb in his hands, right? And the other guy seems to be holding a wiffle ball, but that's not what it is. This is Cain and Abel. So, right? So one of them brings the sheep and one of them brings a plant as their offering. And what's interesting is that they offer that to God explicitly. And God is represented as having a beard. He's an old man with a beard. And yet in the Garden of Eden, which is only like a few years before, so it's not like he could have aged that much, he's represented as Jesus. So this sarcophagus is saying that Jesus has been an active part of the universe from the beginning, which is consistent with what we hear in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. Jesus existed when time and space, even before time and space, as long as there's been God the Father, there has been God the Son. So this sarcophagus is actually affirming that and putting Jesus into the Garden of Eden. And notably, both God as old man and God as Jesus are fully dressed. So the Christians have made a very explicit decision. They are not going to show their gods naked the same way the pagans did. So if we look at the whole picture now, so this is the whole thing. Altogether, this sarcophagus is quoting 6 Bible stories. And that's new, right? The Romans didn't do that. They would just have one mythic scene. They wouldn't jam a whole bunch of stories together. And this sarcophagus is telling a story. So it begins at the beginning with the creation of humans, and specifically with the work that we have to do, like raising wheat. And then it says, because of Adam and Eve's sin, as we know from the Bible, we have to work hard and the earth will resist. The earth will be hard to plow. And worst of all, through their sin, by eating the apple or eating the fruit, death is introduced into the world. And then we see the two people who are going to experience death first, Cain and Abel, right? Cain is going to kill Abel after God rejects Cain's sacrifice to him. And then, so death is introduced on the left-hand side of it. And then in the middle, we see the deceased, the person who commissioned this sarcophagus. So she has suffered the consequences of what has happened on the left-hand side of the picture. The reason she dies, according to Christian theology, is because of the actions of Adam and Eve, right? So, and yet we know that Jesus comes to change that, right? Jesus comes to confer eternal life on the faithful. And so to her right, we see Jesus performing a bunch of miracles. And along the way, so helping someone who's lame, helping someone who's blind, and then changing water into wine, which is an obvious reference to the Eucharist, right? You know, the wine that we drink in communion. And then most importantly of all, Jesus turns and he brings Lazarus back to life. So if this sarcophagus starts with the origins of death, it ends with Jesus conferring eternal life on those who believe, like Lazarus, and by implication, on the woman who commissioned this sarcophagus, who happens to be standing in the middle, right in the middle, the focal point of the whole thing. She's standing in the middle, and Jesus has turned his face towards her. So the sarcophagus is suggesting, because she is a faithful Christian, the gift of eternal life, which Jesus brings, will be given to her. So although at first glance the sarcophagus just seems to be a whole bunch of Bible scenes, it's actually making an argument about where death came from and how Christians are being relieved of eternal death by being given eternal life by Jesus. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I know that's a lot to take in. Does that make sense? It shows these folks knew their Bible stories and wanted to use those Bible stories to say something rather than just, I'm educated, I know the Bible. Like, that's a very carefully constructed kind of theological narrative which is being played out in those figures. Yeah. So instead of just saying, ta-da, here's a battle scene, I'm a tough guy, or ta-da, I know Greek myth, this is saying, this sarcophagus represents what my faith means to me and what the afterlife means to me.
So, Stephen, it's Sue.
Yeah. Hi, Sue.
What do poor people do? Because obviously you had to be very wealthy, and Christians weren't supposed to aspire to be wealthy. They were supposed to give away all their worldly goods. But obviously these people with these sarcophagus had piles of money. Yes,
that's correct. And these sarcophagus start showing up after Constantine makes Christianity legal, after Constantine becomes a Christian. So suddenly it's fashionable to be a Christian, right? You know, as has happened throughout history, what the kings and queens do, the courtiers want to do too, so that they can curry favor with those who are in power. So there's a rush to get baptized after Constantine declares himself a Christian. So suddenly all sorts of people who were rich and had multiple homes and so forth, suddenly they want to become Christians too. And we know about this because the people who are Christians before them complain about it. They say, suddenly everybody wants to be a Christian. They haven't gone through the long period of training that we had to go through to become a Christian. And yeah, you're right. These people have money. And this also coincides with the twilight of the catacombs, right? Like the catacombs where the poor Christians were being buried. And once Christianity gets legalized and they start building churches, like legal churches, which is particularly important in the 400s, then people just want to be buried at churches. And the rich people will still have sarcophagi made, but poor people will just say, just put me in the church graveyard. So humble burials continue even while these ostentatious stone coffins are being made.
Just like Mount Pleasant Cemetery. If you're really rich, have a mausoleum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Peter?
Even there's some amazing carving on these, and this is marble or stone. It must have taken them, I don't know whether it was one artist that was involved or several artists that would be involved. It would take them an awfully long time to do this.
Yeah,
I would think anyway.
Yep, and very expensive. I mean, this isn't something you do in an afternoon, right? This would take weeks and weeks to do.
Oh, yes. Well, I think, because I mean, the work involved in looking at the carvings, huge amount of work.
Yeah, and that's why they were so expensive, because, very, very labor intensive.
Yeah.
Okay, shall I carry on? Okay, so what I want to do now is we've seen that first sarcophagus, about half of it was New Testament scenes. And the left-hand side was mostly scenes from the Hebrew Scriptures. Hebrew Scripture stories show up a lot in these sarcophagi, and they play an important part in trying to get across theological ideas. So I'd like to take another deep dive into a second sarcophagus, which has some Hebrew Scripture stories built into it. So here we are. This one is big. It's got a main panel along the bottom, and then a smaller panel across the top with an inscription. And this one, this too is for husband and wife. So the inscription is in Latin, and my translation is going to be a little bit, doing a word for word Latin translation is kind of confusing. So I'm just going to give you the sense of it. So this is what it looks like. On the second line on the left, you see agape. So that's the wife's name. And at the bottom there, second to last line going on to the full last line, not the like within the frame. Crescentianus, that's the husband. And the translation is beloved spouse agape, who lived with her husband for 55 years, 1 month and 5 days, was laid to rest on the 23rd of December. And for himself, like this sarcophagus was made for himself, Crescentianus, while he was still alive, who was led into the tomb on 30th of August and lived 101 years. So very, very old man had this made for he and his wife. So let's take a look at, so at the top there, so I'm just going to deal with the top for now. Top left, on the left-hand side of the inscription, there's a scene. This is what it looks like in close-up. Does anyone recognize this scene? You saw it in the catacombs. And there it looked like, oops.
Is he calming the waters?
No, actually, this is the 3 men in the furnace.
Right.
In the book of Daniel, it tells the story of Daniel and some of the other young Jewish men who were taken by the Babylonians after the siege of Jerusalem. And they're taken back to Babylon, where they're given a Babylonian education. And they're expected to worship the Babylonian gods. But being good Jews, these 3 young men say, no, we're not going to do that. We only worship the one God. And so the emperor insists that they get thrown into the furnace where they're supposed to burn up and be an example to all the other Jews. But what happens instead is that they pray to God, praising God's glory, and they are not consumed by the fire. And they're kept alive, and they keep singing to God. And the emperor is amazed that they haven't been destroyed. So for some reason, and we'll explore why, this tomb has this story in it. on the one side of the inscription. And then on the other side of the inscription, this is what it looks like. And again, we saw this when we looked at the catacombs too. So on the left-hand side, there's a boat, right, in water. That's what that wavy stuff is. A naked man is being thrown overboard, head first, into the mouth of a sea monster, right? And then if you keep looking to the right, the sea monster basically barfs him up onto the shore.
Yeah.
And he reclines underneath a leafy bower. Anybody recognize this story?
Daniel again.
Oh, Jonah and the
Jonah.
Jonah.
Yeah, it's Jonah. That's right. So Jonah, Jonah had gone off. Jonah had been given the job to go to Nineveh to tell the Ninevites that they had to stop sinning or God was going to destroy them. Jonah hated the Ninevites and liked the idea of them being destroyed, so he headed off in the other direction, hopping a boat to Tarshish. God catches up to him, creates a great storm. The pagans on the boat go, oh, somebody's God must be mad at us. This storm is insane. They wake up Jonah and he says, oh, I think it's my God who's mad at us. And so he is willingly thrown over the side into the mouth of, we know it from Sunday school as a whale, but back then they thought it was a sea monster. And then after 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, it barfs him up on the shore and he goes to warn the Ninevites. But while he is waiting to see what will happen with the Ninevites, he gets really hot sitting on a hill, and God creates this lovely bower which just grows up overnight and gives him shade. And so that's what's happening there. It's sort of condensed the 2 parts of the story of him being barfed up onto the shore and him reclining underneath the bower. So let's look. So that's where those 2 scenes lie relative to the whole. So now let's take a look at the bottom panel, which is much bigger. And we'll start on the left. Okay, so there are 2 Hebrew scripture stories being represented here. One of them starts with an old man who is holding a sword above his head, and there's a small person next to him. Any guesses which Bible story this is?
Sounds like Solomon.
Is it
I think-
Isaiah?
It's
Is it Isaiah?
Abraham and Isaac.
Abraham and Isaac,
Yeah.
exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish people, right? He's really the first Jew, and he had been told by God that he and the very elderly Sarah would have a baby. Sarah laughs, and that's impossible. I'm an old woman. And eventually they have Isaac, and then bizarrely God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on the top of a hill. He's supposed to chop off his head and then burn his body, or slit his throat rather, and burn his body at a time when human sacrifice was considered normal by the other religions around them. And at the last minute, an angel appears and says, no, don't do it. Don't do it. You've proven your loyalty. And a ram appears, and a ram is sacrificed instead. So on this sarcophagus, they've decided to use really like one of the most dramatic stories about Abraham as the start of it at the left-hand side. And then next to it, we see a man with his foot, barefoot, on a rock with a kind of scroll in his hand, pointing upwards, and we see a hand coming out from behind the pillar. Okay, any guess which story this might be? It's not Abraham.
Moses?
Who gets? Sorry, go ahead, Vicky.
Moses?
Yeah, exactly. This is Moses getting the 10 Commandments, and that's the hand of God coming down from heaven, pointing at him. And he's been given the 10 Commandments, so that's what he's holding in his hand. And the reason he's standing on a rock barefoot is that Moses is traditionally depicted at this time as having taken off his sandals when he first meets God at the burning bush. So that's the significance of his naked feet. So if Abraham is the start of the Jewish faith, Moses is the one who receives the law, right? Which defines what being a Jew is. And of course, one of those rules, right, in the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not kill. So God has interrupted the killing of Isaac, and then Moses gets the law which applies to everyone, that we're not supposed to kill anybody. And then the next scene over, we see Jesus at work, and he is holding a document in his hand, while with the other hand, he's healing the blindness of a blind man. And the document is a symbol of his learning, but also a symbol that he is the keeper of the law, which Moses received. And in a sense, it represents the new law, right? The new way of understanding the law. And then right in the middle, and it's always important whatever scene these artists decide to put in the middle, because that's where the focal point of the whole thing is. Who do we see Jesus talking to here? Any guesses? Take a look at the whole picture, like that whole section. I know, it just looks like some bearded guy. But if you look at the bottom, where the man's feet should be, look at the feet. Do those look like human feet?
Nope. Nope.
Nope, they're chicken feet.
Yeah.
And what's tricky about this one is the head of the rooster is broken off, but that's a rooster. So if that's a rooster, who is the man standing next to the rooster?
Peter.
Peter.
Yeah,
Peter.
exactly. It's Peter. Yeah, it's the night
Betrayal.
of Jesus' arrest,
Betrayal.
right? And what does Jesus say to Peter about the rooster?
Before Marcos.
Say it again, Isla?
No,
Or
you deny me before the crow cries 3 times.
Right, before the rooster crows.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So right in the middle of the sarcophagus, we have Jesus talking to Peter. And it's not clear why, but let's keep going and it'll become clearer. And then as we move further to the right, we see Jesus with the woman who is hemorrhaging, right? Who touches the hem of Jesus's garment and is healed from her 12 years of bleeding, right? So, and then again, if we go to the right, we see this is the fishes and loaves miracle, and the wand is being damaged. You can see only part of it, but there was a wand there originally. And then what's interesting is that if you keep going to the end, we come across a scene that we're not really very familiar with. And it's, okay, we've done that. Here. So on the far right here, we see a man with a stick touching a wall. And then it's a little indistinct, but what you're supposed to see is water flowing out of the wall. And then there's 2 Roman soldiers who are getting wet in that water. And this refers to a story which was in one of the apocryphal gospels, where Peter, when he was in jail, used his spiritual power to strike the wall of his prison cell so that water would flow out of it so he could baptize his jailers. Okay? So, what's interesting about this, I didn't really appreciate this until I was in Rome. But one of the things about Christianity is that from the Romans' perspective, Christianity was an Eastern religion because it was born in Israel, right? One of the conquered colonies. That made it foreign and exotic. But they took great pride in the fact that both Paul and Peter were executed in Rome. And Peter was considered to be the first bishop of Rome. And he was imprisoned in Rome, so the story goes. So from the Romans' perspective, that made Paul and Peter hometown boys. This religion wasn't actually some exotic, weird Greek thing, or Jewish thing rather, but rather was something which had grown some Roman roots. And Peter and Paul both, but for this sarcophagus, Peter becomes emblematic of the Roman Church because he's the first bishop of the Roman Church. And of course, this will become the logic which is used for the Roman Catholic Church, where they trace all of their popes back to Peter, right? So in this particular sarcophagus, which was made in Rome, we can see that kind of pride of place for Peter because he's right in the center. The rooster is just there to identify him as Peter. It's not to embarrass him because because he denied Jesus that night. It's to establish that this is the religion of Peter in Rome. Okay, so this one, like the other one that we saw, is telling a story about the faith, and the faith particularly in Rome. And it's significant then that if Peter is in the very middle with Christ, at the far right, the sort of conclusion of it, he is baptizing his enemies, the Roman soldiers. And he's acting like a new Moses by being able to strike the rock and bring water out of it, just like Moses did in the desert. So this whole thing is telling a story. And so if we look upon each one of these panels not as a distinct narrative, but rather as a symbol of a theological point, this whole sarcophagus starts to make a lot more sense. So we would start with Abraham, who's the end of human sacrifice, right? So before Judaism came along, it was normal for people to sacrifice prisoners of war as well as children to their gods. And God puts an end to that among the Hebrews with Abraham. So Abraham represents the end of human sacrifice, but also anticipates the sacrifice of Christ later on, something that Christians made a big deal out of. And next, Moses is the start of the law. We see him here receiving the law, which includes the injunction, thou shalt not kill. And on the same side as Moses and Abraham, the artist has decided to put the picture of three men who were willing to die for the law and yet are saved by God through their faithfulness to the law, right? Then we see Jesus holding the law in his hand, the new law of love. And then we see Peter, who is the new Moses. So just as we saw the first Moses earlier, now we got the new Moses. And then we see the way of love and healing and abundance in practice through these two miracles, the touching of the woman and healing her hemorrhaging, as well as the fishes and loaves miracle. So we sort of see it in action. And then up at the top, we see a symbolic reminder of Christ's death and resurrection, right? Which this sarcophagus doesn't choose to show explicitly in any way. So they use a Hebrew scripture story to hint at what happens next after Jesus has been working all these miracles. Well, he's going to get killed. He'll be gone for 3 days, and then he'll come back resurrected, as Jonah was when he was barfed out of the sea monster. And then finally, Peter will become the head of the Roman Church. So the sarcophagus is actually making a theological statement. It was kind of theological history. And it was commissioned by this man who was 101 years old, which is pretty impressive. These things are really rich. Like, they're not just pictures on a stone. They're actually trying to get something across, and the stories are chosen carefully. Any comments or questions?
That was breathtaking.
Sorry, Bonnie?
That was breathtaking, analysis of those pictures.
So Stephen,
Hundreds of sarcophagi, never Christians ones too, never ever seen a tiny bit as much as you've seen. Thank you.
Well, I did take some time to study them and go, okay, why that part? Why that part?
Stephen, I'm interested in the architecture of the sarcophagus. Can you go back to the picture?
Sure.
You have the rounded arch and then the pointed, almost Gothic arch alternating.
Yeah.
And it just sort of brings the whole thing together. And then the different configurations on the columns themselves, either the stripes or the rounding of the stripes on the columns.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just sort of to bring the pictures forward. Toward
Yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you go.
Yeah. And it makes it all look like it's happening in a building,
Up
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
in a church building. And you know, I guess they're Corinthian columns. They're certainly the kinds of columns.
Corinthian, yeah.
Yes.
Mhm. Decorative. And but who are these little imps running around at the top of these columns?
That is a survival from the pagan styles where they just have these little Cupid or Putti kind of characters everywhere
Yeah.
in these things. But these,
Wonderful.
and they, I don't know if I can expand things here. Yeah, okay. You'll see that they are surrounded by grapes and vines, right?
Mm.
Particularly the one on the right, for instance.
Yeah, yeah,
And that makes sense, right? Because Jesus is the true vine.
yeah.
Right. So, and this is a motif that you do find in pagan art. It's just been appropriated for Christian purposes.
Mm.
So, Michael, when would this one have been done? Like, can you, in what century?
Yeah, this one.
Because it is very it is advanced,
Yep.
the architecture.
This one I think is, this one was done between 330 and 360,
Ah,
somewhere in there. See, the thing is that like the artistry that goes into this was centuries old, right? Because
Yeah.
you know, you saw those battle scenes, right? Those were really impressive too. So the artistry that goes into carving these things was well known, just that the Christians were saying, we want you to tell some different stories.
Stephen,
Mm-hmm.
so where would these people put the sarcophagi? Were they in the churches for the public to see?
Yeah, I'm not sure how public they were because I think that there were sometimes being tombs, but they found these sarcophagi in the catacombs.
Okay.
So in some of like the family crypt areas of the catacombs, and they found them in churches as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would imagine no one did this and then just put it underground in the dirt, you know, like it's be a big
No.
waste, you know?
That would be displayed.
Yeah, probably made to be admired. Now, the thing to notice here, right, is so this is done between 330 and 360. So Christianity is a legal religion at this point. They're not in hiding anymore. The crucifixions have ended because Christians aren't being persecuted by the Romans anymore. And yet, there's no sign of the cross here, unless kind of subtly the mast on the boat is a little bit cross-like. But there's no explicit cross symbolism here at all. There's no hint of Christ's death or his resurrection as actually happening to Christ, although it's implied by the Jonah scene, right? And one of the reasons for that is that, and this is true for all Christian art at this period, like even in the catacombs, there were no crosses, there was no Jesus on a cross in Golgotha, nothing like that. There aren't even any resurrection scenes. And the death and resurrection of Jesus is like the central pillar of the faith. So it's not like they didn't know about it. It's precisely why people become Christians. And they write about it a lot, but they won't show it. And one of the reasons they won't show it, scholars believe, is that crucifixion at that time was the most humiliating form of death that the Roman Empire could deliver on people. That's why they did it that way. They, you know, nailed you to a cross naked and let you asphyxiate on your fluids over the course of a day or so. It's slow, agonizing death, utterly disgraceful. Families would stop using the name of sons who were crucified. They just pretend they didn't exist anymore. So to show Jesus, the most beloved figure in Christianity, on a cross was like this horrific contradiction in terms. And yet we know that Christians get over it eventually because, of course, our iconography over the last 1,000 years has Jesus on the cross all the time. So the early Christians want to get across the idea that through Jesus's death and resurrection, eternal life is being given to Christians. And that's something the Romans didn't really believe in. They sort of believed at best you might have a nice sleep, but not much else would happen for most people. Emperors were a bit different. But your common, the janitor wasn't going to be having a wonderful time in the Elysian fields. They would probably just sort of sleep off in eternity. Whereas Christianity said, no, even the janitors, even the enslaved people, you, if you're faithful to Christ and you live a good Christian life, you will enjoy eternal life just as deservedly as any emperor, any Christian emperor would. So that was a huge shift. So it makes sense that on a sarcophagus of all things, they would want to depict something about Jesus's death and resurrection. So now I want to show you an example of how they do that. There we go. Okay, so this one, this was done in around the year 350. So about 30 years after Christianity becomes legalized. And as I've said with the other ones, the focal point is always in the center, right? So we do see a cross now in the center, and I'll come back to the symbolism of that one. But what's interesting is that, the other sarcophagi which we have looked at, you can read them from left to right. And so let's start on the left on this one and see what happens. So here we, at the far left here, we see a man carrying a cross, which interestingly has a wreath attached to it, and a Roman soldier behind him, sort of guiding him on. On the right, we see a Roman soldier putting the crown of thorns on Jesus. Now, looking at the face of the man who's receiving the crown of thorns, Jesus, is he the same guy as the person carrying the cross?
No.
No, different hair.
Yeah, different hair, different size too, right? The man carrying the cross is clearly smaller than Jesus is, so it's not Jesus. So, and the scene that's being depicted here is biblical. Does anyone know who else carried the cross other than Jesus?
The father that walked into town with his son and was commandeered to carry it because Jesus couldn't carry it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Simon of Cyrene is commandeered to carry the cross for a bit. So what's interesting is that this artist could have shown Jesus carrying the cross, but chose not to. Right? Like, perfectly capable of representing Jesus, could have easily been Jesus carrying that cross, but chooses not to. Instead, decides to use Simon of Cyrene because the cross is still such a reviled object that they can't bear to have Jesus carrying it. It would be as though it would just be insulting to have Jesus carrying the cross at this point. So they have Simon of Cyrene carrying it. And what's interesting is that Simon of Cyrene comes from Libya, and there's a good chance that Simon of Cyrene was black, but he's not represented that way here. And then if we look on the right, I wonder, did I get the text of this? Sorry, 1 second. Yeah. So this is what the Gospel of Matthew says about this scene with the crown of thorns. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him, and they took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. Okay, so that's the scene as described in the Gospel of Matthew. But this is what it looks like on the sarcophagus. Is what they're depicting on the sarcophagus consistent with the text?
Oh.
No, because this is showing it being done with reverence almost.
And
Yeah.
gentle application of the crown.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So instead of showing the Roman soldiers spitting and hitting Christ, laughing at him, he's just receiving a crown as though it's the greatest prize that could be given. And it's done so lightly. It's as though this man is afraid to touch Jesus, right?
And the look on the man's face, he's all admiring him.
Yeah, it's totally reverential, right? And one of the other weird things about this sarcophagus is that it doesn't show the events in chronological order. So if we go past that central panel that shows the cross with the wreath on it, and we go over to the other side, this is what we see. And here too is a scene from the New Testament, very clear. This is where Pilate washes his hands, right? So we see Jesus with a Roman soldier on one side, and then there's a column, and then we see an enslaved person. You can tell he's enslaved because he does not have shoes on, and he's almost naked. And he's got the pitcher of water, which Pilate has just used to clean his hands. Pilate is turned away, and you can see the water coming down off of Pilate's hand, right? See that flow of water?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And Pilate is turned away from Jesus and has his head in his hand as though he's deep in thought, right? So Jesus, however, looks very confident, and that gesture with his hand is a gesture of teaching. So he's been teaching Pilate. Pilate has washed his hands of this affair. He's condemned Jesus to death, and he's turned away, and which is, beautiful symbolism, right? What does Pilate do? He turns away from Jesus, right? It's brilliant. And if you recall, in one of the Gospels, Jesus is discussing things with Pilate, and Pilate at one point says, "What is truth?" A question which a Roman governor should not be asking, because he should know what the difference between the truth and falsehood is. But the Gospel writer has Pilate say, "What is truth?" And here it's representing Pilate as just having made the most grotesque error possible and turning away and being troubled by it. So, and then we come to the centerpiece. And so we see a cross and we see a wreath, right? And the letters in the middle are P and X, so Chi Rho, which are the first two letters in Jesus's name. And this was a common symbol, which is used by Christians to just be a sort of shorthand for Jesus. You see it on inscriptions on tombstones like this one. You also see it on the bottom left here on lamps. That's an oil lamp that Christians used with the P and the X. And even as pins, which people would put on their clothes. So the Chi Rho represents Jesus. So the wreath that we see around the P and the X, that's a victory wreath. And you can see there's a bird that has the wreath in its mouth at the very top there. See, it's an eagle, right? Which is a common symbol of victory for the Romans. So this Roman eagle has conferred a crown of victory, a wreath, on the P and the X, on Christ. And this is just an illustration of how generals and emperors, when they came back from having had successful battles, would have a laurel wreath put on their heads. So the Christians have taken that symbolism of the wreath as a crown, which people deserve to have, and they have made it into a victory sign for Christians, for Christ specifically. So yeah, so there we are. So we have the P and the X, which symbolizes Christ, with a victory wreath, and the victory is over death, right? Because, Christ hasn't conquered the Romans or anything, but through his death and resurrection, he has conquered death itself, which is why it's on a cross. And these two soldiers sleeping underneath it. Does anybody remember why soldiers would be associated with this? Sleeping soldiers specifically?
Would you not watch with me an hour? No,
No, he said that to his disciples.
disciples, right. Who are the sleeping soldiers?
It's in the Gospel of Matthew where
When the
Pilate
stones rolled
says,
away.
sorry, Barb?
Isn't that when the stone, they fell asleep when the stone was rolled away?
That's right. Yeah. Pilate has a couple of guards stationed outside the tomb to make sure that no one goes in to steal the body. And the soldiers fall asleep, and the angel comes and rolls back the stone. And the soldiers wake up absolutely terrified because there's been an earthquake and the stone's been taken back. And so this artist has represented the sleeping soldiers, symbols of the Roman Empire and all of its might, asleep underneath the cross. And he doesn't, the artist, he or she doesn't show Christ being resurrected, but instead uses this symbolism to show the victory of Christ's resurrection over death. But something to think about here is, at the beginning of all this, I showed you all those pagan sarcophagi. They were just full of battle scenes, right? Violence, 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 violence. And as Anne said, these Christian sarcophagi are peaceful, right? They're peaceful. Like, if there's violence, it's always a story of violence being averted.
Mm.
The 3 men don't burn in the furnace. Abraham doesn't kill Isaac, right? The Roman soldiers aren't killed by Christians. They're not, there's no sense of retribution in any of these pictures. The Romans are reverential to Jesus, which, may not be historically true, but it gets across this sense that, this faith is open to the Romans as well. And significantly, in the previous sarcophagus, we saw Peter striking the rock, getting water to pour out of his jail cell so he could baptize a couple of Romans.
Mm.
Right? So the whole faith, like what the sarcophagi said so clearly, is that there's been this huge cultural shift between people going to the forum to watch human beings killed for entertainment to all these scenes about salvation, people having their eyes cured and their legs cured and being brought back from the dead like Lazarus. It's healing, violence to healing. And we see it in what they choose to be buried in. The Romans chose to be buried in battle sarcophagi. The Christians chose to be buried in sarcophagi that evinced story after story after story of healing and rescue and salvation from violence. And in real life, the Christians were the ones who said, we don't want to go to the Colosseum anymore. We don't want to see that stuff anymore. And it kind of dwindled out, and they put an end to crucifixions as well, at least for Christians. Like, the Christians really did try, the original Christians at least, were pacifists in a way, which they felt was absolutely key to their faith, and they showed it on their sarcophagi. If there's violence, God will intervene to make sure nobody gets hurt. And that was the thing that really struck me when I was in Rome, because I hadn't seen the pagan sarcophagi before. And it was just so obvious, this huge, huge contrast. And this is the root of our faith, right? I know it's, especially given the events of the last couple days, where Christians played a big role in getting Trump reelected. Christianity starts off saying everybody of every social class deserves to be healed, deserves to be well. God loves everybody, not just the important people. And they literally went to their graves with that message.
Yeah.
So concludes my presentation. I see it's like 2 minutes to 9, so time is good. But
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you,
Thank you.
Stephen. That was
Thank
very
you.
helpful.